There is a moment in every great man's life when he looks around and realizes the world he helped build has been taken over by fools. For most men, the fear of losing their status keeps them playing the game. They bite their tongues. They cash the checks. They lower their standards to fit in with the new, chaotic modern era. But Sean Connery was not most men. In the summer of 2002, the original James Bond, a man who had defined cinematic masculinity for 4 decades, found himself standing in the freezing mud of Eastern Europe. He was the star of a massive, big-budget blockbuster, surrounded by millions of dollars of equipment. But instead of a disciplined, well-oiled machine, he was watching a production spiral into absolute chaos, led by an arrogant, inexperienced director who thought screaming made him a leader. When the director finally pushed him too far, screaming in the face of a 72-year-old legend and begging Connery to punch him, Connery did not throw a tantrum. He didn't call his publicist. He did something that modern Hollywood still cannot comprehend. He finished the job, walked away, and never acted in a movie ever again. This is the untold story of the disaster that was the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, the disrespectful director who ruined it, and why Sean Connery's decision to walk away was the ultimate display of alpha male power. To understand the magnitude of what happened on that set, you have to understand the standard that Sean Connery represented. Connery did not come from money. He did not go to a fancy acting school. He was a milkman, a bodybuilder, and a Royal Navy sailor from the rough streets of Edinburgh, Scotland. He understood hard work on a cellular level. When he was cast as James Bond in 1962's Dr. No, he didn't just play a character. He forged an icon. In those days, making movies was a grueling, physical, blue-collar job. There was no green screen. There were no digital stunt doubles. If a script called for Bond to fight on a moving train or swim through shark-infested waters, Connery was the one sweating, bleeding, and putting in the hours. He worked under old-school directors' men who wore suits on set, who planned every camera angle with military precision, and who commanded respect without ever having to raise their voices. It was an era of profound professionalism. You knew your lines, you hit your mark, and you respected the cruise time. Connery carried this standard with him for 40 years. He won an Academy Award for The Untouchables. He anchored massive hits like The Hunt for Red October and Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade. By the early 2000s, he was elder Hollywood royalty. He had earned the right to be treated with absolute reverence. But Hollywood had changed. The old-school studio professionals were dying out, replaced by a new generation of auteurs. These were young, arrogant directors who had grown up on music videos and independent films. They didn't care about schedules. They didn't care about budgets. And worst of all, they didn't respect the veterans who had paved the way for them. Enter Stephen Norrington. Norrington was a young British director who had just scored a surprise hit with the vampire movie Blade because he made a cool, stylish action movie. The studio executives decided he was a genius. They handed him the keys to a $78 million blockbuster called The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, a Victorian-era superhero movie where Sean Connery was to play the legendary hunter, Alan Quatermain, from the moment the ink was dry on the contract. It was a mishmash of epic proportions. Connery was a man of intense discipline who believed that preparation prevented poor performance. Norrington was a chaotic, fly-by-sit-over-his-pants director who believed that art had to be messy. He didn't like He didn't like sticking to the schedule. He would regularly halt production for hours while hundreds of crew members stood around doing nothing, just because he couldn't figure out where to place the camera. For a professional like Connery, watching time and money be wasted through sheer incompetence is a physical agony. But Connery was a professional. He had signed a contract, and he was being paid $17 million to do a job. For the first few weeks, he held his tongue. He hit his marks. He tried to lead by example, but the universe, it seemed, was determined to test his patience. The movie was filming in Prague, in the Czech Republic. In August of 2002, Central Europe experienced one of the worst floods in recorded history. The Vltava River burst its banks. The floodwaters tore through the city, destroying everything in their path. The production's massive. Expensive sets, including a giant submarine built for the film, were completely submerged and destroyed. Millions of dollars of equipment were wiped out in a matter of hours. When a disaster of this magnitude hits a production, a true leader steps up. An old-school director would have rallied the troops, formulated a new plan, and kept morale high, but Norrington reportedly unraveled. The pressure of the giant budget, the destroyed sets, and the studio executives breathing down his neck caused his chaotic directing style to mutate into outright hostility. The delays grew longer. The shooting days stretched into endless, exhausting nights. Instead of taking responsibility for the mess, Norrington began taking his frustration out on the crew. He would scream. He would throw tantrums. He was creating a toxic, miserable environment for everyone involved. Sean Connery watched this happen, and his disgust grew with every passing day. Connery is a man who respects the working class. He respects the camera operators, the lighting technicians, and the makeup artists who bust their backs for 14 hours a day. Seeing a young, arrogant director treat a crew poorly is a cardinal sin in the eyes of an old-school professional. Tension simmered for months. The set became a powder keg. Everyone knew an explosion was coming. They just didn't know what the spark would be. The breaking point finally arrived over something utterly ridiculous: an elephant gun. During a scene, a prop weapon, a massive, heavy rifle that Connery's character carried, was supposedly not functioning the way Norrington wanted. Instead of calmly calling for the prop master to fix it, Norrington lost his temper. He halted the entire production. He began ranting and raving, storming around the set, completely halting the momentum of the day. Connery, exhausted, freezing, and entirely fed up with the amateur hour he was witnessing, finally spoke up. He didn't scream. He simply commanded the director to stop wasting everyone's time, get behind the camera, and do his job. For a young, insecure director, being publicly dressed down by Sean Connery, the ultimate alpha male, was a devastating blow to his ego. Norrington completely lost whatever thin grip on his emotions he still had. He didn't respond with logic. He didn't respond with a plan. He responded like a child throwing a tantrum on a playground. According to multiple reports from the crew, Norrington marched right up to the 72-year-old Sean Connery, got in his face, and screamed, "I want you to punch me in the face. Go on, punch me in the face." The entire set went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the dirt floor of the soundstage. Let's pause and consider the reality of this moment. A young director, drowning in his own incompetence, is screaming at the original James Bond, a man who grew up fighting in the streets of Scotland. He is begging to be hit. Why? Because weak men crave drama. They want to be the victim. If Connery had hit him, Norrington could have stopped the movie, sued the studio, and blamed the failure of the production on the violent, unhinged star. It was a pathetic, desperate trap. But legends do not fall for the traps of weak men. Connery looked at the screaming, red-faced director. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't lose his temper. He simply looked at him with an expression of absolute, bottomless pity and disgust. He refused to give Norrington the satisfaction of a physical altercation. He refused to lower himself to the level of reality television drama. He simply turned his back on the screaming director and walked away by refusing to fight. Connery delivered a blow far more devastating than any punch. He stripped the director of all his power. He showed the entire crew that the man in charge was a child, and that the star of the movie was the only adult left in the room. But the nightmare wasn't over. The movie still had to be finished. Connery, acting out of a sense of duty to the crew and the studio, stayed until the final day of shooting. He endured the miserable conditions. He suffered through the chaotic, directionless days. But his relationship with Norrington was entirely severed. They stopped speaking to each other completely. If they needed to communicate, they did it through intermediaries. When filming finally wrapped, Norrington was reportedly so exhausted and broken by the experience that he essentially abandoned the movie. The studio was left with a massive, expensive mess of footage that made almost no sense at this point. Sean Connery could have gone home to his mansion in the Bahamas, cashed his massive check, and washed his hands of the entire disaster. No one would have blamed him, but that is not how a legend operates. Connery knew that a terrible movie would have his face on the poster. He knew that audiences would pay their hard-earned money to see it because his name was above the title. So, he did something unprecedented for an actor of his stature. He walked into the editing room. He took over. He sat with the editors for weeks, sifting through the chaotic footage Norrington had shot, desperately trying to stitch together a coherent story. He worked tirelessly to salvage the pacing, to make the action sequences make sense, and to save the film from being a total embarrassment. When the movie was finally released in 2003, it was not a masterpiece. The damage done during production was too deep to completely fix, but it was functional. It made back its budget at the box office, and anyone who knew the truth of what happened behind the scenes knew that Sean Connery had single-handedly dragged the carcass of that movie across the finish line, but the experience broke something. In him, it wasn't his spirit that was broken. It was his tolerance. When the promotional tour for the movie began, Connery did not hide his disdain. When a reporter asked him where Stephen Norrington was, Connery bluntly replied, "Check the local asylum." Shortly after the release of the film, Sean Connery made an announcement that shocked the world. He was retiring from acting completely, permanently. He didn't make a tearful farewell speech. He didn't do a massive press tour to talk about his legacy. He simply stated that he was fed up with the idiots currently running Hollywood, and he went home in the years that followed. The industry tried desperately to lure him back. Steven Spielberg and George Lucas begged him to return for the fourth Indiana Jones movie. They offered him millions of dollars for just a few weeks of work. They promised him absolute luxury, total control, and the utmost respect. Connery said no. He was offered the role of Gandalf in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, a role that would have paid him an estimated $400 million on the back end. Connery said no. He was offered the role of the architect in The Matrix sequels. Connery said no. He realized a fundamental truth that most modern celebrities never grasp. True power is the ability to walk away. We live in a culture where celebrities will do anything to stay relevant. They will humiliate themselves on social media. They will take terrible roles in embarrassing movies just to keep their faces on a screen. They are terrified of being forgotten. They are addicted to the applause. Sean Connery was addicted to nothing but his own standard of excellence. When he looked at modern Hollywood, a landscape dominated by green screens, chaotic directors, studio executives who cared nothing for the craft, and an utter lack of professional discipline, he realized that his time had passed. The game was no longer worth playing. The respect was gone. The professionalism was dead, and so he spent the last 17 years of his life playing golf in the Bahamas, spending time with his wife, and enjoying the peace that comes from a life well lived. He never compromised. He never came crawling back. He left the world wanting more. Stephen Norrington, the director who screamed in Sean Connery's face, never directed another major Hollywood movie again. The disaster of The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and his failure of leadership on set effectively ended his career in the director's chair. Sean Connery passed away in 2020 at the age of 90. He died as he lived, quietly, proudly, and on his own terms. The story of his final movie is often framed as a tragedy, the sad tale of a legend going out on a bad film. But if you look closer, it is not a tragedy at all. It is a triumph. It is the story of a man who refused to let the incompetence of others drag him down. A man who refused to engage in petty, dramatic fights with weak men. A man who did the job he was paid to do, tried to fix the mess he was handed, and then simply closed the door on an industry that no longer deserved him. There are many actors in Hollywood, but there are very few men. Sean Connery was a man. He understood that true legends don't need to scream to be heard. They don't need to throw tantrums to show power. And they don't need the validation of a broken industry to know their own worth. Sometimes, the most powerful thing a man can do is put down his tools, look the fools in the eye, and simply walk away. If you respect the standard that men like Sean Connery set, and if you are tired of the ego and the drama of modern Hollywood, then you are in the right place. This channel is dedicated to the professionals, the men who built the foundation of cinema with grit, discipline, and silence. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us as we continue to uncover the true stories of the men who let their actions speak louder than their words. Welcome to the Brotherhood. Welcome to Untold Silent Legends.